Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about test-driven development. So let's get into it. So the question in question was actually, I'll bake two into the same one because I think they sort of overlap. Hi Frederick, can you look at test cases and implementations and tell if the team is following TDD? And how hard would you say it is to use TDD on an existing large code base where the approach was never followed? Well, so first and foremost, depending on how philosophical you want to get, you can't apply test-driven development after someone has written the code, because the basic principle behind test-driven development is to write the test first. But I think that this is a case where I'd like to think that well, maybe I'm missing something here, but I would make an argument, and that is that the benefits of using test-driven development comes from the fact that when you are writing tests after you are dealing with, after you've written the code, you have a challenge in front of you now. And that challenge is to figure out what the intended behavior of the code is and be honest enough with your testing so that you write tests for what the intentions are and not the current implementation. Let me break that down a little bit for you. So something that usually happens when you're dealing with people who write tests is that they start thinking about the implementation of the code when they write the test. So basically they look at the code, how it looks, and then they start adding tests and they check that the functions within it works and so. And this is something that I deal with quite a lot of software developers, where it takes enormous amounts sometimes of coaching to get them to understand that what you're doing is just to assert that the functionality that you are looking at is working as you expected it based on your implementation. But that's not how you should do it. That's not what that's not what a good unit test should be doing, and that's not what test-driven development should be about. What the intention behind your testing is. And this is very tough for some people to swallow, because they find it annoying that they have to repeat tests, and they have find that because they want to find quicker ways to test, because they want to reduce the duplication and so forth. And I keep telling them, then you're thinking about this the wrong way. The intention should be, I argue, to assert that whatever functionality is supposed to be there is working as you intend it to work. Now, there is a subtle difference here, and that is that when you can sort of think about it, white box testing versus black box testing, where white box is the thing that a lot of people do, and this is why test-driven development becomes useful, because when you white box test, basically it means that you look at the code on what's ever inside your abstraction. If it's a function or a class, it doesn't really matter. It can be an entire system. You know how it works, and so your test starts to just reflect what is there and what you think about. But what you should be thinking about is that you should think about this as sort of a user who knows nothing about that function, that class, that whatever, and look at the functionality, the feature. What are you expecting as a consumer of this thing that you built? If, as I said, it can be all the way up to system levels, like an entire application, right? And your tests should be asserting what you intend, what you expect. It's a little bit like if you write API tests, for example, when you integrate with some API that you don't actually know how it works, and then you start curling, or you do whatever you call the network, call the endpoints, and you try to figure out how that API works. You have no idea what the code does on the other side of that network call, but you're trying to assert that the feature, like if you send a get, you get whatever you get, or you get posts like they work, etc., etc. And the same thing, the same mindset should be applied here, where if you write your tests correctly, they should be asserting the things that you want to know about the behavior of the code that you are testing, so that nothing unexpected happens. That's the thing that you're after, which is the thing that is which most people don't do if they don't do test-driven development. If you can do that, You can almost think of it like this. You will almost always be better off doing test-driven development if you want to get that thing right. But in practice, the downside with test-driven development is that it's very difficult sometimes to do test-driven development because some code that you are writing is simply too complicated for you to structure. Like you simply have too much to do at any given time, and you can't plan ahead to the point where you can apply test-driven development in every single scenario. But there are situations where, as I said, where you can actually do that, and if that's your flavor, go for it. But I want you to more think about what the results, like the end state, rather than the process that test-driven development brings you. The end state, which is so powerful with test-driven development, is that you have written tests that doesn't actually care about your implementation. They care about the interface and the expected behavior from the consumer's perspective of whatever abstraction you have created, and that is very powerful. It is an example would be if you look at, say, the web standards for our different technology like HTML, CSS, etc., and the browser that you're probably using now, maybe. All of those different browser vendors and the different browsers that you have, we have world standards that are just documents that describe in painful detail how things should be working. And that standard is the thing that the browser vendors use for implementation as a reference, and they basically create their code based on what those criteria are. That is what I'm looking for, or that's what we're looking for. When you write a test, your test should assert that the code is still working as intended for this feature. So, or not featured necessarily, but so for the perspective of the consumer, because you can almost think of every abstraction you create as a tiny part of a feature. So when you write a story card, for example, for an entire feature where you're going to write a nav bar or like you're going to create some API or something like that, think of your test the same way. It's a specification criteria that you're creating for how the thing should behave. And if you've just deleted all the code and had to rewrite it from absolute scratch, it would be very simple, because the tests will all tell you what criteria you have to meet for this abstraction to meet the expectations of whoever is going to use it, just as with the story specification. If the story specification is the only thing you have, well, then you can always write the code based on the story specification. But if you write the story specification based on how the code is working, that's the reverse. That's the thing that you shouldn't be doing. So what I want you to take away from this is that well, I didn't answer, but yes, usually I can see it's. I can tell if people are using test-driven development or not based on their implementation, like how they write their test, depending on how they write it, of course. And at the same time, I argue that you can't truly make something like you can't apply TDD, like the work pattern, because it is basically a work pattern, because it's basically something that can only happen if you start doing it before you write the code. But as I said, at the same time, I don't want you to think about that being the goal. Test-driven development in of itself is not the goal. It is the result that it brings, I argue, that is the thing that you really want. And the thing that it gives you is a honest test suite, and that honest test suite, it doesn't really reflect how the code is working on the inside. All it really does is that it tests the interface and its behavior, what you expect it to do in different circumstances, which some people have a hard time doing, because a lot of software developers just look at their implementation, write the tests that checks something based, like it's almost they use their own code as a reference, when they should sort of just not think about that so much and start thinking in terms of, if I use this function, if this was a third-party library or in a different API or a system that I have to manually check, and I don't know how it works, what would I expect it to do? And write tests based on that, because that way you could delete all that code and still know that the entire feature was working, because there's a decoupling between what the code does and what it should be doing. Have a great day.